The news coming out of the United States further underscores what we've been talking about from the very beginning, which is that India needs to take this seriously.
Bombshell allegations outlined in a U.S. indictment quickened the pulse of national and international politics this week. The step-by-step details of a murder-for-hire plot allegedly orchestrated by an official in the Indian government may help explain the Prime Minister's decision to publicly accuse India of playing a role in the murder of Hardeep Singh Nijjar, a Sikh activist gunned down in British Columbia in June. It also casts new light on those hot takes about the cold shoulder Justin Trudeau seemed to get from Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi at the G20 summit in New Delhi. That's where we're going to start things off with our panel of party insiders. Greg McEachern, former Liberal ministerial staffer, now with CAN Strategies. Melanie Richer, former Director of Communications to the New Democratic Party and now a senior consultant with Earnscliffe Strategies. And Fred Delory, former Conservative campaign manager and partner at North Star Public Affairs. Happy Friday, gang. So this is the 15-page indictment, which spells all of this out and suggests, Greg, that the Americans have a lot of phone evidence, digital evidence, source evidence, and even money that their undercover operative was given. How do we view what happened in September with Justin Trudeau and Narendra Modi now that this has come out in the U.S.?
If I was to be really cynical, if it happens in the United States, we take it seriously. But when it happens in Canada, well, Justin Trudeau must have stepped on a rake here. There were tremendous, horrendous bad takes. And sorry to plug my Twitter feed, but I've been going through them this afternoon in preparation for the show.
Yeah, you've been dunking like Jordan, today.
And it'll never come back and bite me, I'm sure.
Yeah, no.
But yeah, there were some really, really bad takes. And I will remind people that part of the reason why the government chose to tell Parliament the way they did was their hand was being forced by the Globe and Mail.
Yes.
There's a Canadian who does some commentary for CNN, for example, and his column for CNN, when I went back and looked at it, he was questioning why the Prime Minister chose to do it at this time. Well, that's a pretty basic fact to have left out at the time, but it's also very telling about the type of reporting we have. There are a lot of columns that were written about this. What I've noticed as well, there's some politicians as well, but what I've noticed as well about with those columns is a lot of those columnists have not said a word this week about the American revelations.
Yeah, that's interesting. Mel, what's your take on what we learned and how the hindsight we now have because of it?
Yeah, so I think some people did a really good job back in September to treat this very carefully. This was, at the time, an allegation about a Canadian that was killed on Canadian soil. Yep. And it should have been taken with the utmost care and without any partisan politics, any partisan shots as it related to that. And the Indian trip as well, all of the rhetoric that we saw around that about, Justin Trudeau stepping into it or Justin Trudeau false moves, whatnot. I remember at the time I thought, some of this just isn't, and I don't have the word in English still, but c'est pas digne d'un Premier Ministre. Like, it's not at the level that you expect somebody who's running to be Prime Minister to operate in. And that's what I had felt at the time about some of the rhetoric that we saw from Pierre Poilievre. And I'm sure Sikh Canadians across the country probably felt the same way. So to see this coming out of the United States, probably for a lot of folks is not reassuring, but it confirms what they've thought for a while. And hopefully we see more actions taken in the next little bit about how this is going to be dealt with in the future.
Roland Paris from the University of Ottawa, who used to be the foreign policy advisor for the Prime Minister. So, take that in perspective. He called it a vindication yesterday. I don't know. These are allegations, they're not proven. Fred, your take on this one?
Yeah, I think it is a vindication at the end of the day. The Prime Minister rose with some very serious allegations, and we're now seeing, our biggest ally is dealing with the exact same issue and has evidence on it. Again, allegations, yes, but it seems to be vindicated in that regard. At the same time, though, the Prime Minister's reputation on the world stage has been called in question for some time now. So when these stories came out, when the trip to India that didn't seem to go so well, there was a lot of I think valid points being made and questions being raised about that. Then turns out that a lot of that wasn't the reality that we may have been seeing. But So I think that's where we are now, is that, there is a vindication here.
So Greg, your misplay of this week, it's not all about India, but India is kind of part of it. Where'd you want to go with this?
Yeah, so, whatever reason why we are in the atmosphere we're in right now, there's a phrase your earlier panel talked about, the silly season. When it gets near the end of a sitting and government is trying to get legislation passed, and there's a lot of, and let's be honest, this time of year, a lot of associations in town, a lot of receptions. Make good choices out there, people. But there can be, some really bad takes or actions. And I think when you look at everything through the lens of a partisan advantage, this is the trouble that you start to get into. And I would talk about Rachel Thomas's decision to appear as if she is a conservative social media influencer who has a side hustle as a member of parliament. And I can tell you that one of the things you really dislike when you're in an election, such as the Liberals were in 2008, when there's a Thanksgiving weekend, that was the pivot point for a lot of people around Dion, because people had conversations. I would worry for the Conservatives that there's going to be a lot of conversations in Quebec this Christmas about some old takes on, English first, French second. But there's other ones as well. It is more than a week later, and we're still talking about the Conservatives' vote against the Ukraine free trade deal. They're still trying to explain that. And again, that's a partisan take, and it's not helping them.
Okay, we're going to park the Rachel Thomas thing because we're actually going to talk about that a little bit later. But Mel, to Greg's point that on the way partisanship is the first lens, it's like issues are not looked at as an issue to be solved, but rather an opportunity to be exploited, increasingly so, right?
Totally, and an opportunity to try to slam dunk on someone when sometimes it even backfires. But I'm just going to go rewind again. For folks watching at home, when you see that, it's obvious that it's just partisanship, and I think that's what breeds a lot of cynicism with regular Canadians when they do look to see who they're voting for the next one. So, when you see your different plays that you've laid out, what I was thinking about earlier was a few weeks ago talked about how disciplined Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives have been lately, and have been really punching through on housing and affordability. And I think that's why we're seeing the numbers shift the way that they have in polling. I think when you get too comfortable, you make mistakes, and those numbers will maybe change a little bit. Or you make these silly, undisciplined comments, and that's what makes the news. So I think it was a second week of maybe less disciplined messaging from the Conservatives, and we're seeing these different stories.
Fred, in sports they call them trap games, right? Where you think you're so much better than the opponent, you let your guard down, and you start to make mistakes, and it suddenly makes it competitive again. Is this what we're kind of seeing here a little bit?
That's actually a great analogy. It seems like sometimes, maybe you lose a few weeks or a few games. At the end of the day, you still win the championship.
Yes, it depends. It depends when you're bad and when you're good, right?
Right. And look, there's been some issues the last few weeks. There's no question. But at the end of the day, they are playing politics. The Conservative Party is. This is politics. This is the game we're all playing. I shouldn't say it. Only the Conservative Party is playing it, because the other parties, as I've been saying consistently for some time now, I have a narrative. They don't. The other political parties, they're not cohesive with what they're doing. So the Conservatives are always looking for opportunities to build their base, to grow it in different directions that they haven't in the past, and they're doing it. And we're seeing those very large polling numbers because of this.
Yes, as you famously once said on the show, it's called Power and Politics, not politics and feelings, right? All right, Mel, you've also got what you consider to be a bit of a misplay of the week, and it has to do with the environmental agenda of this government.
Yeah, so COP28 started yesterday. The environment minister is heading out to COP. We've seen a few setbacks on the government's environmental plan in the last few weeks, and for a government that was really focused on this being a part of their legacy, part of what they do as government in Canada, it was disappointing to see the government not really have a narrative going into COP. The minister was doing interviews, and all I could hear was, well, we don't really have something yet to present because we're still dealing with the blows from the Supreme Court, which legitimate in the application of what you're trying to announce, but if that's your only message, especially to folks who are maybe questioning your commitment to the environment after the exemption on the carbon tax. Probably not what they wanted to see this week heading into that conference.
Greg, maybe not a clear message going in, but it sounds like there's going to be a clear message coming out, because it sounds like we're going to get an oil and gas emissions cap before COP is over, right? Like Stephen Guilbeault's over there. I guess there will be some sort of companion announcement here in Canada. Otherwise, man the ramparts. I mean, what do you think of this situation with COP?
Well, I think if you look, I think there's 19 Liberal MPs that have been calling for something similar. Going from some National Observer reporting there and from memory, so hopefully I have that correct. So I would not be surprised around that. But, the challenge is, the Prime Minister put it this week, sounded very similar to some things we were talking about last Friday night when we were talking about whether or not the FES, the Fall Economic Statement, broke through. And the Prime Minister said, well, everybody wants to talk about Pierre Poilievre's week and how that went. So you do have so many choices that, what is going to break through. Fred talks about the narrative. Yeah, there's a narrative, but you have this other issue when you're government. It's called governing. You have to do things.
Become a prisoner of that, though.
Yeah, but if you notice, they are still focused on housing, and maybe it's not breaking through every time nationally, but each time it's breaking through very strongly in regional media.
Now, that's a very interesting tactical point we lose sight of here in the bubble. Fred, I know you love the Fez talk, but what about COP? What do you think of this? Are they deliberately underplaying this to keep the attention on other things?
Well, it's funny. I found out today when Mel raised it that we're actually that COP is happening now. So it wasn't something that was on top of radar for a lot of folks. I do know Premier Smith and Premier Moe, I found out, are going as well, though,
yes.
So that's great. No, I think, to Greg's point, I think it's what's going to come out of COP that's going to be important to the Liberals. I do think they've, we're seeing an unwinding of their environmental plan where they're carving out some of the carbon tax. They've lost their Supreme Court case on the court case on plastic straws. So, going into it's hard to message when you're having it unwind by different sources.
I'm fascinated to see what's going to happen with the emissions cap announcement, and we'll be speaking to Daniel Smith next week from Dubai. All right, so Fred, you've got a misplay for us, and it kind of goes back to where Greg started this, and goes back to Rachel Thomas, right? What do you got there?
Yeah, so Rachel Thomas at committee yesterday asked the minister to answer a question in English. And I can tell you, like talking to a lot of conservative Quebecers in the last few days, like a lot of people are very upset about this. And in English Canada as well, where it feels like, this is, our party's trying to grow and show that we're capable of governing. In so many ways we are, but when we make these missteps, and we talked about that earlier today too, about these, they do accumulate. And this is something that, the Bloc Québécois, when we give them ammunition, they use it.
Yeah.
And this is something they have now for the next election. And it's great that she came out a few hours later and apologized, but the clips still exist. They're still there.
Yes, and the apology is not anywhere but an email to the committee. Like we talked about this last time in the power panel, but she uses social media, Mel. That's what this was about. I mean, if you really want to get an apology out there, that's where you do it, right?
And I think goes to show that if the Conservatives want to grow, they're not going to grow in Alberta. They're not going to grow in places where
because they got everything.
No more
that's
seats.
what I mean. Like there's no more seats there. So I don't know what the gotcha there was. Maybe it was like, I think you're just getting so far ahead of yourself that you think everything is partisan, that you can't see that that actually there's some historical context there that's actually quite hurtful. And if you're trying to grow in Quebec and at the cost of the Bloc Québécois, that's just ammunition that they're going to use for a long time. I remember it wasn't that long ago where Alexandre Boulris actually was talking about how the French only or the English only context isn't actually that long, right? Like his dad made less because he was a francophone. So that history and that hurt, a lot of folks still live it in a really real way. And if they don't, their parents have told them about it. So for the Conservative MPs who are in Quebec, I'm sure they're not very pleased right now. And that'll be a hard hill to climb in the next election for sure.
Okay, we got about 60 seconds left in the show. Greg, what's your take?
We were told after Quebec City, where they had their convention, and that was on purpose why they were in Quebec, that they were not going to be, smug. But I think polls have gone to their head, and this is why the Conservatives are making these kind of mistakes. As a friend of mine said to me this week, the drapes don't measure themselves. So people may be, out a little bit ahead. Marie Vastel on your earlier panel talked about how much this resonated in Quebec. Canadians need to realize there is a star system, there's a huge Quebec media atmosphere where this has been generating around for the last 48 hours.
Yeah.
And I think it will they'll have to pay a price for it.
Okay, we got to leave it there, gang. I always appreciate it. Thank you so much, Fred Delory, Melanie Richer, Greg McEachran. Thanks so much.